Hey everyone, hope you're all doing well. Apologies for not uploading a video in a while. I've just been working away on this huge Avatar Book 2 ranking that should be coming out soon, as well as doing some much needed hiking in the Himalayas, which was great. But anyway, in my last video, I finally broke my silence, if you will, on The Legend of Korra, which if you somehow didn't know is Michael Dante DiMartino and Bryan Konietzko's infamous follow-up sequel to everyone's favourite anime which isn't actually an anime, Avatar The Last Airbender. And look, I was slightly trepidatious about discussing The Legend of Korra on this channel, due to the complicated, mostly negative feelings I have towards both the show and especially the way people talk about it online. And I think this is obvious when you watch that video. You can really sense that I'm trying to walk this line between brutal honesty and composure, wanting to authentically express my decade-long disappointment with the show while staying level-headed and not slipping into that reactionary YouTube outrage tone that I've always tried to avoid. The problem here is that we're really dealing with two completely different reactions at once. My emotional fan response to The Legend of Korra as someone who genuinely adores Avatar The Last Airbender and finds its sequel show incredibly frustrating and bewildering. And my more analytical video essayist response as someone who's trying to calmly dissect the show and the discourse which surrounds it without any sensationalism. And here's the thing, I think both of those reactions are valid in their own context, but there's a lot of crossover between them and each requires a completely different vocabulary and tone. One is emotional and nostalgic and incredibly personal, while the other tries to translate that emotion into more objective reasoning and calculated analysis. And keeping those two voices from arguing and contradicting each other is a challenge because, like I said, there is a lot of overlap there. There's also the case of that video being primarily concerned with the discourse surrounding the show, rather than the show itself, because while I do feel somewhat obligated, and to be honest, even a little tempted to share my thoughts on The Legend of Korra as a piece of art, that was never really the point of the video. So what you got from me wasn't an in-depth review and me, intellectually breaking down all my problems with the series. No, it was more just context for the actual arguments I was making. But anyway, what I thought I'd do today, partially to clarify a few of the more contentious points I made in that video, and partially just to keep the discussion alive and dig myself into an even deeper hole, is respond to some of the comments I received on that original upload. It's a classic format I like to do every now and then on this channel. I really enjoy interacting with all of you, so yeah, let's get into it. Let's disagree about The Legend of Korra again. I believe discussions about competence of the Avatar do matter in terms of quality when you factor in how the story handles it. If a character is incompetent, it might need to be addressed if done on purpose. If a character is just stupid because the writers don't know how to write a character that should be competent but isn't, it's a quality problem. It all depends. So this comment is in reference to my point about how people will often discuss Korra's failures as an avatar/human being to prove why the show is bad, which is really just nod on in my opinion. And look, I understand where this person is coming from because yes, if a character is written to be incompetent unintentionally, that absolutely is a writing issue. If the show wants us to believe someone is capable but then constantly undermines them through poor plotting or inconsistent characterization, that's fair game to criticize. But where people start to conflate things is when they treat Korra's in-universe competence as the measure of the show's quality. Like, whether she's a good avatar or not becomes this stand-in for whether the show itself is good, and that's obviously just not how storytelling works. But to be honest, the main reason I picked this comment out is because it really reflects how so much of the discourse surrounding this show, both in the comments section of that video and in general, is focused solely on Korra. Whether or not she's a good character and or a good avatar. And I don't get this. Like, obviously the protagonist is a big part of any show, and Korra is literally the titular character. She has the most amount of screen time dedicated to her. But here's the funny thing which I probably should have mentioned in that original video. I don't even mind Korra as a character that much. Like, don't get me wrong, she's not amazing, none of the writing in the series is, but if I were to write out a list of my I don't know, top 10 biggest problems with the series, Korra would not be on there. Like, how are you gonna spend your whole time criticizing Korra when Mako, Asami, and Berlin are standing right there? The former two being some of the blandest characters I've ever come across, and the latter being, in my opinion, perhaps the least successful and most annoying comic relief figure in television history. Seriously, I don't think this guy has made me laugh once. How the writers of Berlin were also responsible for soccer, I will never understand. But anyway, sure you can find contradictions in Korra's writing, but I don't know, man. At least she has, like, actual personality traits and flaws and a semblance of an arc. At least the writers were actually attempting to do something with her, which is more I can say for most of the other characters in the show. What I always try to lean into is nuance. Korra may be one of my least favourite pieces of art ever. Excuse me, what? I haven't finished the video yet, so maybe you elaborate on this more, but so far, JFC, I hate being a part of some fandoms because of these extreme takes. I can 100% understand if you hate Korra as a character and the direction this show took the universe. I can 100% understand if you aren't entertained by the show at all. I guess. I mean, the fights are badass IMO, regardless of what you think of the characters. But one of your least favourite pieces of art ever? Ever? Is this one of the 3 pieces of art you've ever seen? JFC. So this is what I'm talking about in terms of trying to balance my views as an emotional fan and as a composed critic. And how those two things can overlap and get very complicated and seemingly cause contradictions. Yes, The Legend of Korra is, in fact, one of my least favourite pieces of art ever, and that is purely a gut reaction. When I watch the show, it blatantly feels like I'm watching very high-budget fanfiction. It feels like the writers are genuinely just trying to piss fans of the original show off. I will never understand how the creators looked at the masterpiece they had made and decided to go in the direction they did, with the Great Gatsby setting, and all the demystifying nonsense with Rava and Vaatu, or whatever their names are, and Jesus Christ, making Toph Beifong a police officer? Like, sorry, what? The Melon Lord should never ever be uttering the words, "when I was on the beat." Like, genuinely, what were they thinking? And look, I could go on and on and on. Trust me, there's so much about this show which leaves me in a state of pure befuddlement. I could write 1,000 different sequels to the original Avatar, and none of them would look like this. But here's the thing, this is me being emotional. I'm not saying all these points are gonna hold up in a court of law, if you will. And I'm not trying to convince others to agree with me. Now look, maybe I could take the whole Toph propaganda thing as an example and dissect why this is objectively bad writing, and this is why I say there is overlap between these two voices. But again, that's not what I'm going for. All I am doing is telling you how I feel about this particular piece of art. And the truth is, when I watch The Legend of Korra, I get a level of confusion and this deep pit in my stomach, which very few other shows or films or books or pieces of music are able to give me. However, what I'm not saying is that The Legend of Korra is one of the objectively worst pieces of art I've ever seen. Of course not. Jeremy Zuckerman's score for the show is amazing, even better than the original in my opinion. I mean, Service and Sacrifice, guys? Come on. The animation is mostly great, also. And look, while I don't understand most of the decisions the writers made, I do kind of have a begrudging respect that they went in such crazy directions. Like, the audacity to try some of the stuff they did is seriously commendable, even if I personally don't really like any of it. And I'll bring up another comment here which links to this. Korra aims high, and for that reason I won't ever hold it in as low regard as you do. I will always prefer an ambitious failure to mediocre, riskless slop. And yes, I actually completely agree. The show does not hide behind the legacy of the original, which it could have easily done. It takes truly huge swings with its world building and storytelling, which you kind of just have to respect. And look, the show is not objectively terrible. Like, there's sprinkles of good stuff and good ideas, especially in the 3rd season, which is clearly the quote-unquote best season in my opinion. I like some of the characters, such as Tenzin and Kaya. There are certain scenes which actually go kind of hard. And look, while I don't think the writing of the villains in the show are executed as amazingly as everyone else seems to, I do have to admit that there's tons of ambition there, and they all have aura, which is, you know, something. I mean, Zahir, Bro's aura is off the charts. He's just aura farming the entire season. So yeah, The Legend of Korra is not one of the only 3 pieces of art I've ever seen, but it is one of my least favourites nonetheless. And you also mention how the fights are badass, so I'll just take this time to disagree completely. Like, some of them are okay, but I just personally find the choreography and martial artistry, if you will, really bland when compared to the original, which was just so much more diverse and creative. And don't even get me started on pro bending, like, oh my god. It's literally a mockery of the noble tradition of bending. Like, what were they thinking? I'm gonna poke the bear. Poke it, man. I think the main reason so many people get as mad as they do over The Legend of Korra is because they are extremely nostalgic for The Last Airbender. It's the same when I try to talk to people who grew up with the Star Wars prequels or the Snyder DC films. They're so passionate about it that when something is a letdown or isn't of the same quality, they treat it like the Antichrist. It's not a bad thing necessarily, but keep in mind that The Last Airbender was developed for years before they even pitched it, a luxury Korra didn't get. The creators even said on the Avatar podcast that they spent hours in a room just trying to think of something. That explains a lot. Whilst that doesn't justify the flaws, I would at least hope that people would maybe be a bit more understanding as to why the show is the way it is. Korra is definitely nowhere near The Last Airbender in terms of quality, but when you look at why that is, just know that it could have been a lot worse. You're right. Let's go find The Legend of Korra and give it a medal. The not as much of a disaster as it could have been award. Okay, in all seriousness though, there's 2 main things I want to say about this comment. First of all, I understand what you're saying with the whole nostalgia thing, comparing Avatar fans to prequel fans, but I do disagree, and here's why. The Star Wars prequels are bad, but people are passionate about them because they watched them as children and now have this huge fan community to share that love. Like, you will be very hard-pressed to find someone who watched the Star Wars prequels for the first time in their 20s or 30s and independently decided that they were underrated Shakespearean masterpieces. Avatar: The Last Airbender, on the other hand, is amazing. People are passionate about it because it's an incredible piece of art. People dislike The Legend of Korra passionately because it's not even a tenth as good as the original, at least not in my opinion. And here's the other thing. The only people you're actually talking about are the people who watched Avatar when it first came out, who had that gap of time between the original and Korra, which is actually not that large of a portion of the fanbase considering that the real explosion of Avatar's popularity came years later when it hit Netflix. And that generation of fans who watched The Last Airbender and Korra back to back completely bypassed the whole nostalgia gap you're referring to. For them, and myself actually, who watched both shows back to back in 2015, it wasn't my childhood versus this disappointing sequel, it was just season 4 of a universe I'm binging. And funnily enough, they tend to feel the exact same way about Korra as all the nostalgia merchants. Second of all, and I touched upon this in my last video, I understand that The Legend of Korra had its production problems, and yes, it does explain why the show feels off, but I don't know, man, this might sound mean, but that doesn't actually change anything, in my opinion. The show is the show. Like, when you release a piece of art to the public, you don't get to put an asterisk next to it saying, oh yeah, but we actually had loads of problems, so please be nice to it. Like, no, that's not how it works. Sorry. I think this video fails to address the absolute hate Korra and thus the show as a whole gets. I think you actively dismissed it, lol. Constant real-world related hate, i.e. misogyny, homophobia, and racism, is constantly aimed at Korra, even though she's a fictional character, slipped into every comment section of any Legend of Korra content. These kinds of thoughts are almost always invited and never condemned under the guise of any Korra criticism, including yours. I think often people start with one of these takes and others use it to justify their hate whether or not they've even seen the show. I can agree with some of your takes in this video, but you had me struck at The Legend of Korra being one of your least favourite pieces of art ever, then goes to talk about neutrality while justifying critiques. That's wild to me. I would think that someone in your position/interests has seen a lot of media, so for The Legend of Korra to be one of the worst pieces of art you've seen ever is absolutely baffling to me. This was not a neutral conversation and I'm unsure what the point of this video was, lol. Okay, well, first of all, let me just reiterate. Least favourite pieces of art and worst pieces of art? Completely different box of frogs, mate. But second and more importantly, let's address what you're saying here in terms of the real world related hate aimed at Korra, the character. So this is something that I thought about including in that initial video, and to be honest, I'm not sure why I didn't in the end, and I think you're right to bring it up. I guess it was partially just because I really don't want to become one of those channels which brings in a ton of those types of people, if you get what I mean. But I also think that's partially me just coping and being a bit cowardly and not wanting to upset anyone's apple cart. So I will touch on this briefly. I'm not gonna sit here and pretend that the world doesn't have huge problems with misogyny, homophobia, and racism, and that these things don't find their ways into online fandoms. You can find bigotry in every corner of the internet, and the Avatar fandom is unfortunately no exception to this. Don't get me wrong, I don't think it's anywhere near as bad as certain other fandoms. Most Avatar fans I've interacted with throughout my life have been decent enough people. I do think that this is a fantasy universe which attracts, on average, a more progressive, open-minded type of person. And that probably has something to do with the show's morals, I guess, which are very much linked to peace and love and understanding and, you know, how we're all one and everything. But yeah, of course there's bigotry aimed at Korra. Of course there is. But what we cannot give into is essentially using this argument to shut down any and all criticism of the show or character, because when you label every negative opinion as rooted in bigotry, you end up doing two damaging things at once. First, you invalidate the overwhelming majority of people who just didn't like The Legend of Korra for very fair reasons, usually based around writing. You flatten everyone who's disappointed in the storytelling, pacing, tone, or world building into the same group as actual misogynists and racists, which, aside from being untrue, is just kind of unhelpful. Again, it's that thing I was talking about in the last video of, let me tell you the real reasons why you don't like this piece of art, stranger on the internet who I know nothing about. And second, it ends up watering down the very serious conversations about real prejudice online. When you use words like misogyny or racism to describe someone who simply didn't vibe with a piece of writing, you take away some of the gravity from situations where those terms genuinely apply, and that's just not on, at least in my opinion. And again, I must preface, there is absolutely a percentage of hate directed towards Korra, the character, which is either partially or fully rooted in bigotry. But I also think it's important to zoom out a little and look at the context of this universe, because technically speaking, every single character in the Avatar world is a person of color, at least in how this world is culturally coded. So if we start waving our hand and saying that most people who dislike Korra are just racist or whatever, then by that same logic, anyone who dislikes any of the characters are racist, which of course just doesn't hold up. But okay, maybe you're talking specifically about characters from the northern and southern water tribes who clearly have a different complexion to the other three nations. But then what about Sokka, who is from the same tribe as Korra and is one of the most universally loved characters in the franchise? What about Katara, a headstrong, powerful young woman also from the southern water tribe, who sure gets teased a bit online but who is actually still adored by most fans? What about Kyoshi, a fan favorite who is both a woman and bisexual, and whose bisexuality, by the way, is explored way more than Korra's? And I can't move on without mentioning Kaya, who is literally a bisexual woman from the Southern Water Tribe in the very same show, and who, from what I've seen, has never received any hate. Look, I'm not trying to sweep the bigotry that does exist under the rug here. I just don't think we should let what is a very vocal minority cloud our judgments as a whole and create this space where people are scared to criticize anything because they will be told that they actually have nefarious intentions bubbling underneath the surface. Okay, I hope I've addressed that properly with, the respect the situation deserves. But that is going to be it for now. Thank you for watching this video. I hope I was able to clarify some of the things I said in that last video. At the end of the day, this is not something that everyone's going to agree on, and that's completely okay. But yeah, again, apologies for not uploading in a while. I do have a lot more stuff in the pipeline, so that should be exciting. But yeah, hope you have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one. Ciao.